The first time Kael Riven saw Princess Serenya, he couldn't decide if she was otherworldly beautiful or just terrifyingly regal. She stood at the center of the ornate throne room, her presence commanding even among a crowd of alien nobles who towered over him with their crystalline armor and bioluminescent skin. Serenya's pale, iridescent features glimmered faintly in the golden light, her sharp violet eyes scanning the room with a disinterest that bordered on disdain. Kael, however, was not exactly in awe. He was too busy trying not to laugh at how out of place he felt. "Let me guess," he muttered under his breath to the small spherical drone hovering by his shoulder. "They dragged me here to play the role of comic relief." The drone, a Valroth translation assistant, chirped in response. "You have been chosen as an ambassador of humanity. Show respect." Kael rolled his eyes, shoving his hands into the pockets of his well-worn jacket. "Ambassador, please. I'm just the unlucky guy who happened to be alive when they found my ship drifting out there." At that moment, Serenya's gaze landed on him, sharp as a blade. Kael stiffened under her scrutiny, his half-smile faltering. She looked him up and down as if trying to determine whether he was worth even a fraction of her time. With a flick of her wrist, she dismissed a towering alien suitor who had been mid-sentence in his pitch for her hand. "Is this the human?" Serenya's voice was as smooth as silk, but carried an edge that could cut glass. It wasn't a question as much as a statement of disbelief. Kael inclined his head slightly, offering her the kind of smirk that usually got him into trouble. "At your service, Your Highness." A murmur rippled through the room, the noble suitors bristling at Kael's informal tone. One, a hulking figure with metallic scales, snarled, "Show some respect, Earthman. You're in the presence of royalty." Kael raised an eyebrow but bit back a retort. He wasn't here to pick fights, though he seemed to be unintentionally great at it. Instead, he focused on Serenya, who was now watching him with a mix of curiosity and amusement. "You speak as if you're unimpressed to be here," she said, stepping down from the dais with an elegance that was almost hypnotic. Her long, flowing gown shimmered like liquid starlight, each movement exuding grace. "Not unimpressed," Kael replied, "just not sure why I'm here." "You've got an entire galaxy of suitors. What's one human supposed to add to the mix?" Her lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, though her eyes remained calculating. "That remains to be seen." Kael couldn't tell if she was mocking him or genuinely intrigued. Either way, the room felt like it was holding its collective breath. Serenya motioned for him to follow her, turning without another word. Kael hesitated, but the drone nudged him forward. "Lucky me," he muttered, trailing after her as the crowd parted like the sea, their judgmental stares practically boring holes into his back. Once they were alone in a smaller chamber, Serenya stopped and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I've rejected every suitor brought before me, human. Kings, warlords, diplomats, none of them worthy of my time." Kael leaned against a nearby pillar, crossing his arms. "And you think I might be different? I don't know what to think of you yet," she admitted, studying him. "But you're unpolished, unpredictable. That makes you interesting." Kael laughed, shaking his head. "I've been called a lot of things, but interesting isn't usually one of them." Serenya tilted her head as if weighing her next words carefully. "You're not like the others. You don't bow, you don't flatter, and you don't pretend to be something you're not. That in itself is a rarity." Kael shrugged. "Well, I don't exactly have much to offer. I'm just trying to survive out here." "Survival is not insignificant," she said softly, a note of something unspoken in her tone. "Perhaps it is more valuable than the grandiose promises of those who only want power." For the first time, Kael thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her otherwise impenetrable demeanor. It was fleeting, but enough to make him wonder what lay beneath the surface of this seemingly untouchable princess. Before he could think of a response, she straightened, her regal mask slipping back into place. "You may stay for now," she declared. "Consider it a trial." Kael blinked. "A trial? What kind of trial?" Serenya's lips curved into that faint, enigmatic smile again. To see if you're worth my time, of course. He opened his mouth to protest but thought better of it. Instead, he gave her a lopsided grin. Well, I guess I've got nothing to lose. As she turned and left the chamber, Kael couldn't help but wonder what he'd just gotten himself into. Something told him this wasn't going to be as simple as playing the role of an intergalactic oddity. No, there was something deeper at play here, something that neither of them fully understood yet. The days blurred together as Kael found himself navigating the alien politics of the Valroth Dominion. Serenya's trial was nothing like he had expected. It wasn't about grand speeches or elaborate gestures. No, it was much more subtle. Every conversation, every interaction seemed like a test, though he had no idea what the rules were. At first, he found the entire situation amusing. Serenya seemed to have a strange habit of arranging private, casual encounters with him, under the guise of assessing his character. She would invite him to her private garden for a walk, or sit with him during public meals, all the while observing him as if he were some sort of exotic creature in a zoo. Kael wasn't sure if he should feel flattered or insulted. He had spent most of his life working odd jobs on forgotten space stations and drifting through the void. Never once had he imagined being studied like an artifact. But there was something compelling about her sharp, inquisitive nature, something that kept him engaged despite his better judgment. During one of their quieter meetings in the garden, he found himself genuinely laughing at a joke she made. Serenya had a dry, cutting humor that seemed out of place among her refined, royal demeanor. It was in that moment that Kael realized she wasn't just a princess. She was a person with her own doubts and frustrations, just like him. "That's the third time you've made that face," Serenya observed, her gaze flicking to Kael. He had been staring at a floating sculpture that hummed softly in the background. "What are you thinking?" Kael blinked, coming back to the present. "Just wondering how something that looks so expensive can be so pointless." She raised an eyebrow. "You're quite cynical for a human." "I'm not cynical," Kael protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm just realistic. You can't build the perfect sculpture and expect it to solve all your problems." "Perhaps," she mused, studying the sculpture with a thoughtful expression. "But what if it's not meant to solve problems? What if it's simply meant to be appreciated?" Kael shifted uncomfortably. There was something in her tone, a softness that he hadn't expected. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, or the way her guard seemed to lower whenever they spoke. Either way, it wasn't lost on him that there was more to her than met the eye. The silence between them stretched on for a few moments before Serenya spoke again. "You're different from the others." "Yeah," Kael said, his voice casual but his heart pounding. "In what way?" "You don't try to impress me," she replied, her tone almost wistful. "Most of the suitors, they all think they can win my favor by showing off. Power, wealth, status. But none of them understand that those things don't matter. I guess it's because I don't have any of that stuff," Kael said with a grin, his hands in his pockets. "What I do have, though, is a lot of sarcasm and some decent survival instincts." Serenya's eyes softened, her lips curving up just slightly at the edges. "And that's why I find you interesting." Kael tilted his head, an eyebrow quirked. "You find me interesting?" She didn't answer at first, her gaze distant, as if she was contemplating something deeper than the conversation they were having. But then she looked back at him, and Kael saw something shift in her expression. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not like them." For a moment, the air between them seemed to crackle with something unspoken, a connection that neither of them could fully understand. Kael's heart beat a little faster, though he couldn't tell if it was from the intensity of the moment or the awkwardness of what they were both feeling. "Well," Kael said, breaking the tension with a casual shrug. "Maybe you just need a guy who doesn't care about your status or your empire. I'm no king, and I sure as hell don't care about your throne. I just want to get off this rock and back to my own ship." She stared at him, and for a second, Kael wondered if he had said too much. But instead of reprimanding him or laughing it off, Serenya seemed to study him with something like curiosity. She took a step closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "I don't want a king," she said quietly, almost as if to herself. "I want someone who can see me for who I really am, not just what I represent." Kael's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. The words seemed to hover between them, and he could feel his heart beating in his ears. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the garden, followed by the sharp, panicked voices of guards. Serenya's expression immediately hardened, the moment between them shattered. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice snapping into authority. "I'll deal with this." Without another word, she turned and hurried toward the entrance of the garden. Kael was left standing there, his mind racing. He didn't know what just happened or if he had imagined it all. But something was changing, and he couldn't help but wonder if it was the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could have expected. As Serenya's figure disappeared into the shadows, Kael found himself at a crossroads. Whatever this was, whatever he felt, it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Kael Riven had no idea what the future held. But he was certain of one thing. He couldn't walk away from it. The next few days unfolded in a whirlwind of confusion and tension. Kael had hoped to learn more about Serenya's true self during their private moments, but every time he got close, someone pulled her away. Guards, nobles, matters of state. She was always surrounded by the weight of her title, the expectations that came with it. And yet, every time they met, there was that same undercurrent of something deeper, something unspoken. He tried not to overthink it, but it was hard not to. The way Serenya had looked at him after the garden incident haunted him. It was a look he hadn't expected from a princess, let alone one as powerful and untouchable as her. For a fleeting moment, he'd seen vulnerability, and it had left him wondering what she was hiding. But there was something else lurking in the background, something he couldn't ignore. That something came in the form of a thick, tension-filled silence. Kael was used to chaos, the kind of danger that came with smuggling goods across hostile sectors or barely escaping the grasp of bounty hunters. But this felt different, as if something was building just under the surface, and it wasn't just the political intrigues of the Valroth Dominion. It was the silent challenge between him and Serenya, the growing tension between them that neither could address directly. One evening, he found himself walking through the palace corridors, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his mind heavy with questions. He had learned quickly that Serenya's life was a balancing act between her personal desires and the crushing expectations placed on her by her people. She couldn't afford to indulge in what felt right, not when her future, and the future of the Dominion, hung in the balance. Kael paused outside one of the grand windows, gazing out at the sprawling city below. The lights of the distant skyscrapers flickered like a constellation, casting a soft glow on the horizon. It was beautiful in a way, but it also felt isolating. The whole palace, with its towering walls and endless halls, felt like a gilded cage. A voice broke through his thoughts. "I didn't expect to find you here." Kael turned, surprised to see Serenya standing at the entrance, her silhouette framed by the soft light spilling into the corridor. She was dressed in a flowing gown, her hair cascading over her shoulders like a wave of silver. Her expression was unreadable, but Kael could sense the weight of her presence. "I tend to wander," he said with a shrug, trying to keep things casual though his heart was racing. He hadn't expected to see her so late, and certainly not in this part of the palace. It was a place reserved for the elite, for those who belonged to the upper echelons of the Valroth society. Kael, on the other hand, felt out of place here, like a shadow among the stars. "I can see that," she replied, her voice softer than usual, as if she were sharing a private thought. "There's something about this place, isn't there? The isolation, the constant expectations." Kael gave her a sidelong glance, surprised by the openness in her voice. "Is that how you feel? Like you're just living up to expectations, she nodded, her eyes meeting his with a rare intensity. Every day since I was old enough to understand what was expected of me. My people, they want a ruler, a symbol, someone who will bring them power, safety, but they never seem to care what I want. Her words hit him harder than he expected. In that moment, Serenya didn't seem like the untouchable princess of the Valroth Dominion. She seemed human, vulnerable. The weight of the crown she bore, the isolation she felt, it was all laid bare for Kael to see. "And what do you want?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. It felt like the kind of question that shouldn't be asked in this palace, in this kingdom where every word had weight. But for some reason, with Serenya, it felt like the right question to ask. She hesitated, looking down at the floor as if trying to find the words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know any more." Kael took a step closer, drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. "That's okay. No one really knows, not all the time." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for something, some kind of answer. "I'm not supposed to be like this. I'm supposed to be strong, decisive. But the more I try to be what everyone wants me to be, the more I lose myself." Kael didn't have a solution to offer her. He didn't even know what kind of advice to give. But what he did know was that the woman standing before him wasn't just a princess. She was someone who had been trapped by the very thing that was meant to make her powerful. And in that moment, she needed someone who could see her, not as a symbol, not as a ruler, but as a person. "I think," Kael started, his voice rough with emotion, "I think you're stronger than you realize. You don't have to be everything they want you to be. You can be more than that. You just have to choose it." Serenya's eyes searched his face, her expression unreadable. Then, for the first time since Kael had met her, a smile broke through the walls she had built around herself. It was small, tentative, but it was there. "You make it sound so simple," she said, her voice carrying a lightness Kael hadn't heard before. "I never said it would be easy," he replied with a grin, his heart pounding in his chest. "But it's worth it." For a moment, the distance between them seemed to shrink. The vast palace, the political games, the weight of her responsibilities, it all seemed to fade into the background. In that moment, it was just the two of them, standing there in the quiet of the night, sharing something that neither of them could fully name yet. And for the first time since he had arrived on this planet, Kael felt like he might be exactly where he was meant to be. The days that followed their quiet conversation felt like a strange kind of limbo. Serenya was still every inch the princess, cloaked in her royal duties, but there was an unspoken understanding between her and Kael. It lingered in the air like an electric charge, present in the brief glances they exchanged, in the way their conversations shifted. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something undeniably real, something neither of them could ignore. The political tension, however, was growing, and it threatened to pull them back into the roles they had been given. Serenya's courtship had become a spectacle, an event that drew suitors from all across the Dominion, each more lavish and extravagant than the last. It was supposed to be a show of power, of wealth, but to Kael, it felt more like a display of desperation. Every suitor seemed to be vying for Serenya's favor, presenting themselves with their finest gifts and most elaborate performances. But none of them ever looked at her the way Kael did, not with curiosity, not with respect. They only saw the crown she wore. Kael couldn't help but feel the weight of that every time they were together. There was something about the way she carried herself, something fragile just beneath the surface. Serenya wasn't just resisting these suitors. She was resisting her own future, the life she was being forced into. It wasn't until one evening, when Serenya had invited him to join her for a meal in one of the palace's grand halls, that he truly understood the extent of the pressure she was under. They sat at a long, polished table, surrounded by a dozen other guests, noble men and women, dignitaries from various sectors of the Dominion. The room buzzed with laughter and clinking silverware, the air heavy with the weight of formalities. Kael felt like an intruder in this world of opulence. every movement scrutinized by the polished eyes of the elite. But Serenya didn't seem to care about the attention. Her focus was entirely on him. "You're awfully quiet tonight," she remarked, her voice a soft contrast to the chatter around them. She was dressed in a gown of deep violet that shimmered with the light of the chandeliers, her hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. Despite the spectacle of the evening, her eyes seemed distant, far away from the lavish spread before them. "I'm just taking it all in," Kael replied, trying to mask the unease he felt in the presence of so many high-ranking officials. He caught a glimpse of the suitors eyeing Serenya from across the table, each one trying to present themselves as worthy of her attention. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of bitterness. It wasn't about her at all. It was about the power that came with her. "I don't belong here," Serenya admitted, her voice low as though confessing a secret. "I'm surrounded by people who want me for everything except who I am. It's exhausting." Kael studied her, his eyes softening. "Then why do you stay?" She met his gaze, her expression vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed others to see. "Because if I don't, everything I've worked for will crumble. I'll lose the only thing my people respect." "You don't have to keep pretending," Kael said, his voice firm but gentle. "You're more than this crown, Serenya. You're more than this palace." The words hung in the air, weighted with truth. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the pull between what was expected of her and what she truly desired. It wasn't just a matter of choosing him over the suitors. It was a matter of choosing herself, her future, her own happiness. Before Serenya could respond, the doors to the hall opened with a flourish, and the room fell silent as a high-ranking official stepped in, flanked by 2 guards. His presence was commanding, and his eyes immediately locked onto Serenya, his expression one of cold calculation. "Princess Serenya," the official said, his voice thick with authority, "I must speak with you. It is a matter of great urgency." Serenya's face remained impassive, but Kael could sense the tension in her posture. This wasn't just a routine visit. Something was wrong. The room erupted into hushed whispers as Serenya rose from her seat, her face hardening into the mask of royalty. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she said, her voice cool and composed. "I'll be back shortly." Kael watched as she walked away, her figure slipping out of the hall with the official in tow. The room quickly returned to its previous state of idle chatter, but Kael couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. The moment they shared earlier, the quiet admission, the vulnerability in her eyes, felt miles away now. He remained seated, his thoughts racing. What was it that the official had come to discuss? And more importantly, how much of this was her choice? Minutes later, Serenya returned, her expression unreadable. The lightness from their conversation had vanished, replaced by an air of cold authority. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice clipped. "There are matters I must attend to." Kael nodded, understanding that the moment was over. He had seen the flicker of something in her eyes, the pressure, the burden of a life she hadn't chosen. And for a brief moment, he wished he could just take her hand and make it all disappear. As the night wore on, Kael found himself retreating further into the shadows. He could see it now, more clearly than ever. Serenya wasn't just fighting for her own happiness. She was fighting for the very soul of her people, caught between duty and desire. But as the evening drew to a close, Kael couldn't help but wonder if it was possible for her to ever truly choose what she wanted, or if the weight of the dominion would crush that possibility forever. He left the hall quietly, his heart heavy with the knowledge that, for Serenya, the real battle had only just begun. The following days were a blur of meetings, formal dinners, and the continued parade of suitors, each more polished and refined than the last. Serenya seemed to float through it all, a graceful figure caught in the web of politics and expectation. Kael, however, couldn't escape the growing sense of unease gnawing at him. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the way Serenya withdrew further each time they spoke, the way her eyes seemed to be searching for something she couldn't name. He knew better than to push her. She was a princess, burdened with the weight of her people's expectations. But there was something about her, something real, that made him wonder if she could break free from it all. And every time he saw her with one of her suitors, with that cold, distant smile, he felt the sharp edge of jealousy he couldn't quite suppress. It wasn't until the morning of the Grand Assembly, a massive event where the most influential leaders of the Dominion gathered to discuss political strategy, that everything came to a head. The atmosphere in the palace was tense, a heavy current of anticipation filling the air. Kael could see it in the way the servants moved, the stiff posture of the palace guards, and the way Serenya's personal attendants hovered around her like satellites. It was the perfect moment for a political maneuver, and Serenya, as usual, was at the center of it all. Kael, invited by Serenya to attend the assembly as her personal guest, found himself standing on the fringes of the grand hall, watching as Serenya held court. The room buzzed with conversations, leaders from various factions making their demands known, offering alliances or, more often, posturing for power. Serenya, dressed in a flowing, regal gown of deep blue, stood at the head of the room, a calm and composed presence amidst the chaos. But Kael could see the strain in her eyes. The small, tight-lipped smile she offered to each diplomat, the way her shoulders tensed when a particularly forceful voice echoed through the hall. Every decision she made seemed to be weighed down by invisible chains, her every word calculated to maintain the delicate balance of power. He wanted to approach her, to offer her some kind of escape from this suffocating world. But he didn't know how. He was just a smuggler, no match for the political machinations that surrounded her. As the morning wore on, a sudden hush fell over the room. The doors to the hall swung open, and in walked a figure that made even the most powerful leaders fall silent. Lord Thuron, the High Chancellor of the Dominion, entered with the commanding presence of someone used to holding sway over entire galaxies. His dark, sharp eyes scanned the room, a subtle, almost predatory glint in them as he locked eyes with Serenya. "Princess," he said, his voice like silk over steel, "it is time we discuss the future of the Dominion. The fate of your people cannot be left to chance." Kael felt a chill run through him as he watched the exchange. Lord Thuron wasn't just a diplomat, he was a strategist, a master manipulator. And from the way Serenya's expression hardened, he could tell that this was not a friendly visit. "The future of the Dominion is always under consideration, Chancellor," Serenya replied, her voice as calm and measured as ever, though Kael could hear the undertone of something else, a challenge. "You are the future of the Dominion, Princess," Thuron said smoothly. "And yet your indecision is costing us all. You have yet to choose a suitor, a partner who can lead alongside you, someone who can bring stability to this fractured empire." Kael's heart tightened. He had heard rumors of Thuron's intentions before, but hearing him state them so openly was another matter entirely. The tension in the room was palpable, the whispers rising in volume as Thuron continued. "The people demand a ruler who is strong, who can command respect," Thuron said, his gaze flicking briefly to Kael, who stood in the corner, trying his best to remain unnoticed. "A ruler who understands the value of alliances, of strength in unity." Serenya's eyes narrowed. "I understand the value of unity, Chancellor, but I also understand the value of choice." For a brief moment, Kael saw a flicker of defiance in Serenya's eyes, something she hadn't shown in days. She was tired of being pushed, tired of being told what was best for her. And Kael felt a surge of admiration for her, despite the fact that the situation was rapidly escalating. Lord Thuron, however, wasn't easily dissuaded. "Choice is a luxury, Princess. And luxuries are for those who have time to waste. You will not have the luxury of indecision for much longer. The Dominion needs a ruler who will act, who will lead us to victory." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the weight of Thuron's words hanging heavily over them all. Kael could feel the heat rising in his chest. He wanted to step forward to challenge Thuron's arrogance, but he knew better. This was not his fight, not yet. And then, in that moment of stillness, Serenya did something unexpected. She stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Thuron's. "You are right," she said, her voice suddenly ringing with a clarity that cut through the tension. "The Dominion does need a ruler. But it needs a ruler who will lead with heart, not with fear. Someone who understands what it means to truly serve their people." Kael watched in awe as Serenya stood her ground, her presence suddenly more powerful than anything he'd ever seen in her before. She wasn't just a princess, a figurehead. She was a leader, and she wasn't afraid to show it. Lord Thuron's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing in displeasure. "I'm not interested in speeches, princess. The people will not wait for you to decide." Serenya's eyes softened, but the resolve in them remained. "Then perhaps it is time for the people to wait." The words hit like a thunderclap, reverberating through the hall. Kael could see it in the faces of the other leaders. They hadn't expected this. Serenya was no longer just playing her part. She was asserting her own agency. As the room fell into stunned silence, Kael felt something stir inside him. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when Serenya truly chose herself, and by extension, the future she wanted to build. And for the first time, Kael realized that this wasn't just her battle anymore. It was theirs. She had made her choice. And it wasn't about power or the crown, it was about her and the life she wanted to lead. The question now was whether Kael could find a way to stand beside her, not just as a smuggler or a soldier, but as something more, something she could trust. The air between them had shifted, irrevocably, and for the first time, Kael could see the path ahead. The days that followed Serenya's defiant stand against Lord Thuron were marked by a subtle shift in the palace. There was a quiet tension in the air, a ripple of change spreading through the corridors and chambers of the Dominion. Serenya had not backed down, and while it had rattled the political elite, it had also emboldened the people. Whispers of her courage began to circulate beyond the palace walls, and the murmurs grew louder with each passing day. Kael could feel it in the way the servants looked at him now, with a hint of respect instead of the usual wariness. Even some of the palace guards, who had once regarded him as little more than a curiosity, seemed to acknowledge his presence with a certain level of understanding. The wind was changing, and it was no longer just Serenya who was the target of scrutiny. It was everyone around her. Every decision, every action, had consequences now, and Kael found himself in the middle of it all. As the days turned into weeks, Serenya seemed to become more withdrawn, the weight of her newfound defiance settling heavily on her shoulders. She had taken a step toward independence, but that freedom came with its own set of challenges. There were those in the palace who had grown comfortable with the status quo, those who had always believed in the unquestioned power of the royal bloodline. Serenya's refusal to play by the rules, to choose a suitor out of political necessity, was seen as a direct challenge to their authority, but Kael could see the toll it was taking on her. The long hours spent poring over diplomatic reports, the sleepless nights, the quiet moments when she would look out over the balcony, lost in thought. It was clear that the fight wasn't over yet. In fact, it had only just begun. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kael found himself standing by the large balcony of Serenya's chambers, the weight of the situation pressing in on him. He had grown accustomed to the way she carried herself with an air of regal detachment, but there were moments, like now, when the mask slipped and the vulnerability beneath became apparent. She stood at the railing, her back to him, staring out at the sprawling city below. The lights of the Dominion twinkled in the distance, but it was the quiet that caught Kael's attention, the weight of silence that had settled over the palace since Serenya's confrontation with Thuron. It wasn't just the stillness of the night. It was the stillness of anticipation, of a moment before everything changed. "Serenya," Kael said, his voice low, careful. She didn't turn to him, but he could feel her attention shift, the subtle tension in her posture. "You're worried," he said, more statement than question. Her voice was soft when she replied, "I'm not worried, I'm preparing for what's coming." Kael stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the way she stood, poised but distant. "You can't do this alone." Serenya's fingers tightened around the railing, and for a moment Kael thought she might say something else, but she remained silent. "I'm not alone," she finally said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I have advisors, I have allies, I have everything I need to lead. What I don't have is," she stopped herself, shaking her head, "I can't afford to be distracted by things that don't matter right now. Things like me." Kael's words hung in the air, sharper than he had intended. Serenya's back stiffened, and for a moment he thought she might turn and walk away. But then, slowly, she exhaled as if the weight of the conversation had finally caught up with her. "No," she said quietly, "things like this, all of this." She waved a hand, gesturing to the vast expanse of the palace, the glittering city below. "The crown, the titles, the politics, it's all so much more complicated than I ever thought it would be. And the more I try to find my own path, the more I realize how many people, how many things are standing in my way." Kael stepped closer, his hand hovering near hers on the railing. "You don't have to face it alone." Serenya turned her head slightly, enough for him to catch the flicker of emotion in her eyes. For the first time, she didn't hide it. There was frustration, yes, but also something else, something deeper, something more raw. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my whole life being trained to lead, to serve my people, but I don't know what that means anymore. And I'm afraid that if I choose the wrong path, everything will fall apart." Kael's heart tightened as he looked at her. She was not just a princess now. She was a woman, struggling with the weight of the world and the impossible expectations placed upon her. It was easy to see her as untouchable, as a figure of power and grace, but in that moment he saw her for what she truly was. Someone lost, someone trying to find her way in a world that had already decided who she should be. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Kael said, his voice steady, his words offering a quiet reassurance. "No one does, but I'll be here, if you'll let me." Serenya's eyes softened, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. She looked at him for a long moment as though weighing his words, considering them. Then, with a small sigh, she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in weeks, Kael felt a glimmer of hope, real, tangible hope. Not just for her, but for them. He had known from the beginning that he was not the man she had been expected to choose, that their paths had been as different as night and day. But in that moment, he saw the possibility of something more, not because of who they were or what they represented, but because of who they were together. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new, a new understanding, a new connection. Serenya wasn't just the princess anymore, she was a person, and Kael wasn't just a smuggler. They were two people standing at the edge of a future neither of them had expected, but one they could choose for themselves. And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, Kael made a promise, silently to himself. He wouldn't let her face it alone. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The next few days passed in a blur, with the weight of Serenya's admission hanging between them. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic moments, but there was an unspoken understanding that had formed in the silence. In the midst of the palace's constant political turmoil, Serenya's relationship with Kael had become an unexpected constant. They were both navigating treacherous waters, but somehow they found solace in each other's presence. Serenya had become more focused, more determined, though the burden on her shoulders was evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes. She spent her days in the council chambers, meeting with advisors, making decisions that shaped the fate of her people. But in the evenings, she would retreat to her private chambers, seeking refuge from the political maelstrom that constantly threatened to consume her, and Kael. He found himself drawn deeper into her world, though he wasn't entirely sure of his place. It was one thing to stand by her side in quiet moments, offering support and comfort, but it was something entirely different to navigate the dangerous, intricate world of court politics. Still, he knew he couldn't walk away, not now. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Kael stood at the entrance to Serenya's chambers, a mixture of apprehension and resolve in his chest. Tonight, the council had convened to discuss the escalating unrest within the Dominion. The ruling factions were divided, and tensions were reaching a boiling point. Serenya had invited him to join her for the debrief, though he knew little about the intricacies of interplanetary diplomacy. "Are you ready?" Serenya's voice, soft but steady, broke through his thoughts. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable, yet there was a trace of vulnerability in her gaze. Her hair, usually meticulously styled, cascaded loosely around her shoulders. She had abandoned the royal trappings for the night, opting for a simple, yet elegant tunic. Even without the weight of the crown on her head, she radiated an undeniable presence. "As ready as I'll ever be," Kael said with a small smile, trying to hide the knot of uncertainty in his stomach. Serenya studied him for a moment before nodding. "You don't have to be here, you know. This isn't your fight. You could leave the palace for a while, take a break from all of this." Kael's brow furrowed. "I'm not going anywhere." The briefest flicker of surprise passed across Serenya's face, but she quickly masked it, her features smoothing into the composed expression she wore for the rest of the world. "I didn't mean to." "I know what you meant," Kael interrupted, stepping toward her, "but I'm not running. Not anymore." Her lips parted slightly as though she was about to say something, but she seemed to think better of it. Instead, she turned toward the hallway, her pace steady but deliberate. "Come on then. The council's waiting." The two of them walked in silence, the sounds of the palace around them muted by the weight of the moment. The council room was a grand space, with high ceilings and towering windows that overlooked the city. As they entered, a hushed murmur spread across the room. Serenya's presence was magnetic, and though the members of the council were accustomed to her authority, there was a subtle shift in the air when she entered the chamber, a quiet acknowledgement that things were changing. As they took their seats, Kael couldn't help but feel out of place. The advisors and council members, most of whom had served the Dominion for decades, regarded him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. But Serenya, though young and relatively new to the throne, had earned their respect. Kael could see it in the way they deferred to her, the way her every word held weight. Serenya addressed the room, her voice unwavering as she laid out the situation. There had been a series of coordinated attacks on Dominion trade routes, and it was clear that someone, or something, was attempting to undermine her rule. The tension between the Dominion's various factions had reached a boiling point, and even her allies were beginning to question her leadership. "We can't continue like this," Serenya said, her gaze sweeping over the room. "We need a plan to restore order and security, but we cannot afford to make rash decisions. This is not just about military power, it's about trust. The people must know that their leaders are united." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Kael could see the wheels turning in the minds of the council members, each of them calculating the best course of action, each of them weighing the risks. But Serenya wasn't done. She turned to Kael, her gaze softening just a touch. "I've been considering other options," she continued, "and I need your perspective." Kael blinked in surprise, momentarily unsure of what she meant. But when he looked at her, he saw the quiet plea in her eyes. He was no diplomat, no political strategist, but he knew Serenya better than anyone in this room. And in that moment, he realized that his place here wasn't just as a passive observer. It was as someone who could offer a different perspective, one grounded in the realities of the world outside these walls. "The problem is trust," Kael said, finding his voice. "The Dominion is divided because its people no longer trust those in power. You've done what you can, Serenya, but there's a larger game at play here. The factions that oppose you, They won't stop until they've taken everything from you." A low murmur spread through the council at his words, but Serenya remained calm, her eyes fixed on him. "And what do you suggest?" Kael leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You need to show them that you're not just another ruler playing by the old rules. You need to remind them that you're not afraid to take risks. You need to take control of the narrative." Serenya's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, curiosity perhaps, or a recognition of the truth in Kael's words. "Control the narrative." "Exactly," Kael replied. "The Dominion is fractured because its leaders have played it safe. They've appeased the elites and ignored the needs of the people. You can't just rely on the old guard anymore. You have to show them that you're a leader who will do whatever it takes to protect your people, even if that means making enemies." Serenya considered his words, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. "I'll take that into account. Thank you, Kael." The council room was quiet for a moment, the tension thick in the air as they all waited for her next command. But before Serenya could speak, one of the council members, Lord Firius, a staunch supporter of her reign, cleared his throat. "My princess, if I may," he began, his tone respectful but firm. "We cannot afford to make hasty decisions. The situation is delicate. We must consider all options." Serenya's gaze hardened, but she remained composed. "I understand the importance of caution, Lord Firius, but sometimes inaction is the greatest risk of all." The room was silent for a moment as her words hung in the air. The balance of power had shifted again, and Kael could feel it. This was no longer just about Serenya's rule. This was about the future of the Dominion, and Serenya was ready to fight for it. And Kael, standing by her side, was ready to fight with her. The following days were a whirlwind of action, with the tension in the Dominion escalating at an alarming rate. Serenya, once the reluctant ruler, had become a force to be reckoned with. She spent long hours in the council chambers, carefully considering each move, weighing every alliance and betrayal. It was no longer just about diplomacy. Every decision she made had consequences that rippled through the galaxy. Kael, ever by her side, had grown more attuned to the intricacies of court politics. He had been surprised at first by how quickly he adapted to the shifting landscape, but it was Serenya's unyielding determination that had driven him. He had never been the type to follow rules or conform to expectations, but watching her face the dangers of her position with such strength made him want to give everything he had to her cause. Their moments together, though rare, were the only times when they could truly relax. Even then, there was a distance between them, a wall built by the overwhelming stakes of their world. They didn't speak of love or the promises they'd made to each other, because the weight of their duties was always there, hovering like a shadow. One evening, after another council meeting, Serenya found herself staring out over the balcony of her chambers, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She had been awake for hours, going over reports and preparing for yet another diplomatic summit. The weight of the crown felt heavier with every passing day, and she was no longer sure how much longer she could bear it. "Serenya." Kael's voice broke through the silence, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the concern in his eyes. He had been her anchor, the one person who understood her better than anyone else, and yet, in the midst of everything, she felt a distance between them that she couldn't explain. "You should rest," Kael said, stepping into the room. "You've been at this for days." "I can't afford to rest," Serenya replied, her voice tight. "The Dominion is falling apart. The people are restless, the factions are tearing each other apart, and I don't have any answers. Every decision I make just seems to make things worse." Kael approached her, his gaze softening. "You're not alone in this. You have allies, people who want to see you succeed." "I don't know if that matters anymore," Serenya admitted, her voice cracking with frustration. "I've done everything I can, and it's never enough. No matter how hard I try, I keep failing." Kael stepped closer, his hand gently cupping her cheek. You're not failing, Serenya. You're doing everything you can to protect your people. You're making difficult choices, and sometimes that's all you can do. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, allowing herself a moment of weakness. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. I'm so tired, Kael. Kael's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. He knew what it was like to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, to feel as though everything was slipping through your fingers. But he also knew that Serenya wasn't the type to give up. You don't have to do it alone, Kael said quietly. I'm here, always. Serenya opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. There was a flicker of something, perhaps hope or maybe just the need for connection. But before she could respond, a sharp knock on the door interrupted them. Princess Serenya, a voice called from the other side. There's urgent news. Kael and Serenya exchanged a brief look, and with a sigh she stepped away from him. Come in. The door swung open to reveal one of the palace guards, his expression grim. Your Highness, there's been an attack on the outer colonies. It appears to be coordinated. Multiple ships have been sighted near the trade routes. We believe they are from the opposition factions. Serenya's heart sank. She had known the tension between the factions was growing, but this was different. The Dominion's hold on its territories was fragile at best, and an attack of this magnitude could lead to a full-scale rebellion. Prepare the fleet, Serenya ordered, her voice hardening. I want all available ships ready for deployment immediately, and send word to the council. They'll need to be briefed. The guard nodded and quickly left, and Serenya turned back to Kael, her expression now steely with resolve. This is it. The factions are moving against us. Kael nodded, his jaw set in determination. We'll handle it. Serenya hesitated for a moment, then walked over to him, her hand resting briefly on his arm. Thank you for everything. I couldn't do this without you. Kael met her gaze, his own emotions welling up. We're in this together. With that, they moved swiftly to the war room, where the next phase of their fight would begin. As Serenya stood before her advisors and strategists, Kael remained at her side, his presence a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. The war room buzzed with activity as everyone prepared for the worst. Serenya's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with each new report. The attack on the colonies was no longer a surprise. It had been coming. But what she hadn't anticipated was the speed with which the opposition had mobilized. We need to strike back now, one of her generals, Jerk said, his voice tense. If we allow them to gain ground, we'll lose everything. Serenya nodded. Agreed, but we need to make sure we hit them where it hurts. We can't just react, we have to plan carefully. Kael watched the proceedings with a quiet intensity, absorbing every detail. The stakes were higher than ever, and Serenya was pushing herself to the limit. But there was something in her that had changed, something deeper than just the weight of responsibility. She had become a leader, not just in title, but in action. And as he watched her, Kael realized that he was no longer just standing by her side as an observer. He was part of this, part of her world, their world. Serenya turned to Kael, her eyes meeting his across the room. There was no need for words, just a silent understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together. And in that moment, Kael knew that he was willing to fight for her, for them, no matter the cost. The battle was fierce, more chaotic than Serenya had anticipated. The opposition factions, led by a coalition of disgruntled planetary lords, had come together in a show of strength, throwing everything they had at the Dominion's defenses. The space above the colonies had become a battleground, the once peaceful skies now filled with explosions, fire, and the distant hum of weapons fire. Serenya sat in the command center, her fingers tapping restlessly on the table as her fleet responded to the incoming threats. She had issued orders, made calls, but the reality of war had settled over her like a heavy blanket. Despite her calm exterior, every fiber of her being was on edge. This battle would define her rule. Kael stood at her side, his presence a silent anchor in the chaos. He had always been calm under pressure, but even he couldn't ignore the tension in the air. He had seen battles before, fought in wars of his own, but this felt different. This was Serenya's war, and the stakes were more personal than he'd ever known. As the reports came in, Serenya's strategic mind shifted into overdrive. She knew that if they didn't strike fast, they would lose the colonies and perhaps the entire Dominion. Her orders were swift and calculated. Every ship, every fighter, every defense point was placed with precision. But still, a nagging fear gnawed at the back of her mind. The Dominion had spread itself thin in the past few years, and it was only a matter of time before the cracks in its armor were exposed. A sudden alarm blared, cutting through the tension in the room. The lights flickered and the air seemed to grow heavier. "Princess," one of the technicians called out, his voice strained. "We've lost contact with the fleet at Zethar Colony. They've been surrounded. Send reinforcements immediately," Serenya commanded, her tone sharp. She didn't wait for a response, already turning to Kael. "We need to go. Now." Kael didn't hesitate, stepping forward as the command center's door slid open. They made their way to the shuttle bay, their every step in sync as they moved quickly but efficiently. Serenya didn't speak, her mind already calculating the best route, the safest way to reach Zethar Colony before it was too late. The shuttle's engines roared to life, the vessel lifting off with a jolt as it soared into the blackness of space. Serenya remained at the helm, her hands steady on the controls, while Kael sat beside her, watching her every move. She was a warrior now, no longer the princess of a broken empire. She was the leader of a force that would stop at nothing to protect its people, even if it meant sacrificing everything. As the shuttle approached Zethar Colony, the vastness of the conflict became clear. The colony was barely visible under the cloud of smoke and fire, its defensive shields flickering as they struggled to hold back the incoming forces. Serenya's eyes narrowed, her jaw tight with resolve. "We won't let them fall," she muttered under her breath, her hands moving quickly over the controls. "Not today." The shuttle dropped out of warp, the colony's surface now fully visible, and Serenya's heart clenched at the sight. There were fires everywhere, on the outer rim, near the trade docks, and even in the heart of the city. Ships were locked in battle with the Dominion's remaining fleet, while soldiers fought on the ground, struggling to hold their positions. A jolt ran through the shuttle as it entered the atmosphere. Kael gripped the armrest, his face drawn, but he said nothing. He knew what Serenya was capable of, and he trusted her with his life. As they descended toward the landing zone, Serenya didn't give Kael the chance to speak. She was already thinking ahead, what they would need, how they would take back control of the colony. The shuttle touched down in a cloud of dust and debris, its landing gear scraping across the jagged terrain. Serenya was out of the shuttle before it had fully landed, her boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. "Kael, cover the eastern perimeter," she ordered, her voice cold with determination. Without a word, Kael nodded and moved to the side, drawing his blaster as he prepared for the fight ahead. Serenya turned her focus to the buildings around her, watching the chaos unfold. The opposition forces were everywhere, armed, organized, and ruthless. She could already see the signs of their leader, a former general, now turned rebel, known for his cunning and ruthlessness in battle. "Target the signal boosters first," Serenya commanded through her comms, watching as the Dominion forces responded with precision. "We need their communications cut." As her forces moved in, Serenya felt the weight of her decision settle in. She had put herself at the forefront of this war, knowing full well that this wasn't just about saving the colonies. This was about her future, the future of the Dominion, and the lives of the people who depended on her. But as she led her forces through the wreckage of Zethar Colony, another truth became clear. This war had changed her. She wasn't just fighting for her people anymore. She was fighting for Kael, for the future they might one day have. And she couldn't let him go, not now, not when everything they had built was on the line. As the battle raged around them, Serenya's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear the blaster fire, the screams of soldiers as they fell, but none of it fazed her. She was in control, moving like a machine, her mind running through scenarios, calculating outcomes. It wasn't until she turned to check on Kael that she realized something she hadn't let herself consider before. In the middle of this chaos, she had found something worth fighting for, Kael, and she would do anything to protect him. The battle for Zethar colony raged on, but as the hours stretched into what felt like days, the tide began to shift. Serenya's tactical brilliance, combined with the relentless determination of her fleet and the resolve of her soldiers, started to turn the opposition back. It wasn't without its losses, far from it, but every victory, no matter how small, brought them one step closer to reclaiming control. In the thick of the conflict, Serenya's focus never wavered. Every order she issued, every strategy she devised was executed with precision. But in the quiet moments between skirmishes, she found her thoughts drifting to Kael. The bond they shared, forged in the fires of war, had deepened in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't just his loyalty, nor his unwavering support that had drawn her to him. It was his quiet strength, his ability to stand by her side even in the face of overwhelming odds. They had become something more than just allies. She had come to rely on him in ways she couldn't explain, ways she didn't want to admit. And yet, despite the intimacy that had grown between them, Serenya still held back. She couldn't fully allow herself to think about what the future might hold. Not while the Dominion's survival hung in the balance. As the last of the enemy ships were cleared from the orbit of Zethar colony, Serenya stood amidst the devastation. Smoke still billowed from the ruins of several buildings, and the sound of the wounded and dying filled the air, but the colony had been saved. "Princess," Kael called, his voice echoing from behind her. "The fleet's been secured. We've repelled the invasion." Serenya turned to face him, her expression unreadable, but the weight in her eyes spoke volumes. "I know," she replied, her voice steady, yet tinged with exhaustion. Kael's eyes softened and he stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You did it. You saved them." "I couldn't have done it without you," Serenya said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, they simply stood there, the chaos of the battle receding into the background as the connection between them took center stage. She had always known that he would be there for her, but now, standing in the aftermath of war, the reality of their bond seemed more profound than ever. Kael reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was gentle, a silent promise, and Serenya felt a flicker of warmth spread through her chest. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if she could afford to think about the future when her empire was still on the brink of collapse. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something other than the weight of her responsibilities. "I'm not going anywhere," Kael said, his voice low and steady. Serenya met his gaze, her breath catching in her throat. "I don't know what I'm doing, Kael. I don't know if I can do this alone." "You don't have to," Kael replied. "I'm with you. Every step of the way." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that steadied her. They didn't need to speak of love, not yet, not when the future was uncertain, not when the cost of their war still loomed large. But in that moment, Serenya knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone anymore. As they stood together, looking out over the colony they had just saved, the promise of a new beginning loomed on the horizon. They would rebuild, they would fight, and they would face whatever came next side by side. For the first time in a long while, Serenya allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future, one where love, hope, and unity could thrive amidst the chaos of a fractured world. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to have both, to rule and to love. But only time would tell what the future truly held. For now, she had Kael by her side. And that was enough.